LGBT-friendly place to work.
Yes, I do. I'm very proud of that.
Those are all my follow-ups.
Mr. Slavin?
Thank you. In response to, I think, one of the questions on, I can't remember, I apologize if it was from the board or if it was from my friend to the left, you said that the question related to whether Commander Minor committed an intentional integrity violation wasn't a close call to you. And it wasn't a close call to you even prior to his interview that he gave explaining himself, right?
I had enough concern, as I stated earlier, to go forward with an internal investigation. I certainly would have been open to some explanation in the investigation that would explain and dealt with my concern. At the end of the days, I did not have my concern dealt with to the point where I felt any different than when I asked for the investigation to be conducted.
Okay. So Commander Minor's assertion that directly offended meant something different than what he originally thought at the time didn't assuage your concerns?
No, I actually don't agree that directly modifies or offended in a way that would have not allowed Commander Minor to answer the question fully and honestly.
Okay. I'm going to jump around a little bit because I want to follow up on this. Did you testify that you think Sergeant Lewis asked good questions to Commander Minor during Commander Minor's interview in the Chief Slavin investigation?
I'm not sure I testified that he asked good questions. I do think that the questions he asked were based upon the knowledge he knew at the time and the answers he received when he was asking these questions. Of course, if the answers were more forthright, full, and truthful, I think he would have asked deeper questions and different questions than he ended up asking.
So similar questions related to, my next question relates to the questions that Sergeant Lewis asked to Chief Slavin. Do you think that he asked good questions and conducted a good interview with Chief Slavin during that interview?
In all fairness to Sergeant Lewis, I've not recently reviewed the questions he asked to make a conclusion on that. I'm going to do that.
Okay. When you did review the investigation, were you concerned with the fact that Internal Affairs only asked about the one statement that was made by Chief Slavin and not any questions about the sexuality?
To be honest with you, I didn't look at the pluralism or the singularity of the comment. I looked at the end. There's something I didn't already know. As it turned out, I think I knew more than the investigation revealed.
Right. You knew more than the investigation revealed about Chief Slavin. You also knew more than the investigation revealed about Commander Minor, right? Because you knew that Commander Minor had brought concerns forward to his chain of command.
That's true. But I knew that the action he was taking, I knew nothing about his testimony.
Okay. I think you said in response to the chairman, we were talking about some timing of the questions in the follow-up, that you said nobody in the department was talking about it, which is Chief Slavin's comments, and nobody in the department was making a complaint to Internal Affairs. Was that your testimony to the chair?
My testimony was, it should have been certainly, that between the time that I dealt with the issue with my office, other than conversations I had with the chiefs, I never heard anyone complain to me about Chief Slavin's behavior.
Right.
Up until the time that they mean those are brought up in my office.
Sure. And in that meantime, Lieutenant Bonnet gave information in his Internal Affairs interview that he was concerned about the fact that no formal investigation had occurred, right? And he brought that concern to Commander Minor, at least?
That's my understanding.
And then Commander Minor, there's some evidence that Commander Minor brought that same concern to Chief Pop.
That's my understanding.
But Chief Pop didn't raise that to you.
Chief Pop came to me regarding the conversation he had with Commander Minor after I had already dealt with Chief Slavin.
Okay. I want to clarify some additional context for what happened because I think it's important to talk about this based off of your answers before. So during Lieutenant Bonnet's interview in Chief Slavin's investigation, Lieutenant Bonnet expressed fear that he would face retaliation, correct?
I understand that's correct. Yes.
Did that concern you?
No, because first of all, he expressed a fear of retaliation. He brought no retaliatory actions that were brought against him or felt against him that I could investigate. His fear of retaliation is like, okay, if something occurs, you need to let us know, or something appears to have occurred, you need to let us know so we can investigate it. But his fear of retaliation, I don't know what my responsibility would be. At that level of the investigation, wasn't completed yet, to deal with this fear.
So you're not concerned sitting here today that there might have been a culture in your organization that if somebody brought forward an allegation against an assistant chief, that they might face retaliation?
I have no information other than the fact that Lieutenant Barnett felt he was going to, he feared retaliation for coming forward, which by the way has not occurred. Other than the fact that he brought forward, I don't know about any, what's the word I'm looking for, climate of retaliatory behavior in the Scottsdale PD. And if you know of some, I'd be very interested in following that up, but I don't know if there's a culture of retaliation. I certainly haven't retaliated, nor have my chiefs evidence of retaliation. Any complaint the chief had, he dealt with in the appropriate fashion by bringing it to the individual's supervisor. So that's not retaliatory to express your concerns.
Okay. You provided some testimony before about the Cronin investigation and its purpose. I just want to make sure that the record is clear. The Cronin investigation only occurred as part of a legal settlement that happened related to Commander Minor's matter, right?
It occurred after legal settlement, but prior to legal settlement, I went to Dr. Thompson, the city manager, my boss, and the city attorney, and requested.
Wait.
Sorry, all right, go ahead.
Hold on.
Go ahead.
Chief Rodbell, you may share information that you told Dr. Thompson.
Yes, ma'am.
Was that what was council present though, because, well, I would imagine the privilege would attach even if, I would expect the privilege would attach if Chief Rodbell and the city manager were talking to the council. You don't need a one-on-one.
That's true, because they're
So
both,
when you
they're both
say
management
when you
employees.
say bring forward, make sure that the chief understands that council was not there, that the council was not there.
Correct. If you, anything that you spoke with separately to Dr. Thompson, you may share.
Okay.
All right.
So prior to the agreement being written, and I had no knowledge of the negotiations when the legal, and the settlement was being drawn up, I was not involved. I went to my boss and requested to be investigated for how I handled the Slavin matter. And so the fact that it became part of your agreement was okay with me. I already asked for it.
Okay. One moment. You provided an answer before related to the concept that as a member of the As-Post board, you review a number of, or you've reviewed a number of investigations that related to integrity. Would you agree with me that the vast majority of the integrity investigations that you've reviewed as a member of the Post board involve the subject of an investigation providing false or incomplete information related to their misconduct versus a witness?
So the question is majority? Question
Yeah.
is the majority of the cases?
Yes.
The answer to that is yes.
You were asked questions by the vice chairman about the delay in the investigation and whether that would have had an impact on the witness's ability to provide statements. And I think it's your testimony that 180 days is reasonable. Was that your testimony?
And my testimony was I had 180 days to complete a complaint. The 40 days, whatever 6 weeks it was, 42 days, 40 days, was not unreasonable.
Do you think that some of those witnesses that were in attendance at the meeting or were being asked questions about what specifically was said would have had a better recollection had they been asked closer in time to the meeting?
Perhaps not fully in the did, but perhaps.
Okay. And then, I didn't ask you this question originally, and I think it relates to the chairman's questions. it's your testimony that AR 333, either Part 1 or Part 2, allows you to handle the Slavin statements made by verbal counseling and no further record?
No, I didn't testify that. I believe that there's a very serious allegation. I would have been obligated to do a more formal investigation. I did not see this as that level. I saw it as serious, I saw it as critical to deal with it, but I didn't see it as a Part 1. I think if it's a Part 1, I probably should have done an internal investigation.
What about, you think that AR 333 Part 2 doesn't require an investigation?
Again, I handled it the way I handled it, and I was investigated for the way I handled it. I felt I made the right decision.
Did you feel like you followed AR 333's policies?
I felt I made the right decision, yes, sir.
So I understand you felt like...
I feel as though I did, as a senior ranking officer, as a chief disciplinarian of an organization, as a direct report, that I followed how I interpreted Part 2 offense could be followed. And I felt I did the right thing. Yes, sir.
Did you review AR 333 prior to making the decision to issue a verbal counseling without any further investigation?
No, I did not.
That's all I have.
Does the vice chair have anything to?
One last question. Do you know what prompted, after the closure of 048, Assistant Chief Slavin to make the document request for the transcripts?
Yes, sir, and of course, she's going to be testifying soon, but my understanding is that he found out that people who were uninvolved in his case were asking open record requests for copies of the file. And he felt that other people were asking for it, he should know what's in it. So he then asked for a copy of it so he could read the file. It's about himself, which he's entitled to. But he didn't ask for it until he found out that people not involved in this were actually asking to read it. So he thought maybe it's in his best interest to re-listen.
Thank you.
Mr. Any follow-up to that question?
No, thank you.
Mr. Sabella?
No.
I'm going to ask, though I expect you'll be staying here, and witness be excused.
Yes, thank you.
And you've been here through all the admonitions to not speak with anyone about this until completed, which will be my Tuesday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Council, it is now 2:30. We're right on time. Is Assistant Chief Slavin present?
Mr. Chair, I think he is. I do have something I need to put on the record and bring to the board's attention just before we bring Chief Slavin in. I just want to remind everyone here that the purpose of this hearing is to protect Commander Minor's rights and to determine whether there is a reasonable basis for the discipline or just cause. The purpose of the hearing is not to investigate or impact the rights of Chief Slavin. That it's important that we stay focused on the issues that are here because the board is also part of the city. And Chief Slavin has not been issued a notice of investigation, and the Peace Officer Bill of Rights protects him just the same way it protects Commander Minor. So I wanted to make sure everyone understood what areas Chief Slavin can talk about and what areas he cannot go into. Chief Slavin is certainly a first-hand fact witness into anything involving Commander Minor's investigation, any allegations of Commander Minor's wrongdoing. Everything related to that is very clearly in bounds, and he can fully testify to that. My concern is that there is an argument regarding comparative discipline. Chief Slavin was subjected to discipline, but unless Chief Slavin is setting the disciplinary practices that apply to Commander Minor, that would also be fair game if something about, anything that Chief Slavin himself did impacted the discipline on Commander Minor, that's also okay. But if there are questions to Chief Slavin about whether he thinks he himself should have more discipline or other offenses or things like that, that investigation of Chief Slavin he's here under city subpoena, so every question we all ask him is a compelled statement. So observing his rights the same way we have to protect Commander Minor's rights, I just wanted to make that clear before we bring him in so that we know with, board questions and.
Can you give an example or two of what it's not about?
Asking Chief Slavin questions about statements that he gave in his own interviews, and do you think you should have answered this way or that way or something like that? His statements are his statements, and you may draw your conclusions about his statements, but additional fact-finding from Chief Slavin about his participation in discipline where he himself is the subject of discipline, that impacts Chief Slavin's rights. So if we're asking questions the same way questions have been asked about, well, do you think Chief Slavin should have had do you think what you did is a part one? That would be you asking Chief Slavin to impose discipline on himself, and you are part of the city. He has not been issued a notice of investigation, so that's part of his rights here. And so, again, we want to be fully transparent and forthcoming. Anything at all related to Chief Slavin's involvement with Commander Minor or Commander Minor's discipline, or if he personally did anything or acted on anything firsthand, absolutely ask away.
Are you basically saying that anything pertaining to 048 is out of bounds?
There's an argument about comparative discipline. I understand that argument has been made. You can ask Chief Slavin if he had, if he received a verbal counseling and what that consisted of, but asking him to comment on statements that he made to IA, his participation in that interview, the board has a full record of what he said. So
Can he be asked what he self-reported verbally to the chief?
yes. Yes. So that discussion, what did he self-report and what did the chief say, that conversation, yes. But things that Chief Slavin is talking to IA about, should you have said this instead of saying that? That's the same question that we're here to talk about with Commander Minor. But Commander Minor has his attorney here. He's had due process. He's had exhibits weeks in advance to review. So I just wanted to make sure that we all understand that Chief Slavin is just as protected by these rights as Commander Minor.
Mr. Smog, would you like to address that?
I would. It's wrong on a number of levels. First, I'll say it's...
Better say it's incorrect.
Okay, it's incorrect as a matter of law on a number of levels. First, if this is a motion in limine, it arguably should have been made ahead of time. Second, I don't think that the city is representing that Chief Slavin is under investigation for his conduct. In fact, I think we're pretty clear that Chief Slavin's conduct has already been investigated and discipline is going to issue. Police officers are not protected from a further investigation or discipline if some new fact is discovered or if misconduct comes out during a hearing. So unless the city's representing that Chief Slavin is currently under investigation, then the Peace Officers' Bill of Rights and the Notice of Investigation do not attach. They're very relevant because, for example, the evidence, as you know, says that one of Chief Slavin's defenses is potentially, I talked to Internal Affairs for periods of time off the record and I explained to them certain things or not. I'm definitely going to ask about that, and that's a perfectly correct line of questioning. So unless Chief Slavin is actually under investigation, he has no rights to an NOI or anything else like that. And if he provides a misstatement or false statements, that's not protected by the Peace Officers' Bill of Rights, because the city could then give him an NOI and give him an opportunity to explain himself. So it's not proper to limit the line of questioning at this point in time.
Ms. Day?
Okay, a few responses to that. Number one, I think it's very telling that Mr. Serbalek raised the issue of Chief Slavin's defenses. that proves the point. Chief Slavin is not the defendant. The city is the defendant. The conduct at issue is Commander Miners, and please understand, every single thing that Chief Slavin knows that relates to Commander Miners' process and to Commander Miners' discipline is fully within bounds and can be fully explored in any way possible. We've gone fairly far afield, and we've tried to allow Commander Miners' counsel to have as wide of latitude as we can legally do in putting on whatever case he feels he wants to put on. That includes an argument that the discipline is unequal. But the only relevance of everything to do with Chief Slavin was Chief Slavin given different treatment than Commander Miner was given. But Chief Slavin did not give himself the treatment. That's not an issue. It's what Chief Slavin's superiors decided to do with that information. And did Chief Slavin's superiors treat Commander Miner the same way? So if we're talking about Chief Slavin's, again, redisciplining, the concern that I have here is there an investigation of Chief Slavin open right now? No, absolutely not. But we have heard testimony from many witnesses, including the chief, that as things come up, we absolutely do open investigations. And Chief Slavin himself had a matter that was considered resolved, was reopened on a complaint from POSA. And so today, Mr. Servalik has asserted a few things, a few questions and concerns that he has that he clearly thinks that Chief Slavin should be disciplined for. We disagree and can argue about that. And part of the difficulty we have here is that we can't present a case about that because Chief Slavin is not a defendant. This is not Chief Slavin's disciplinary case. This is Commander Miner's case. So if Chief Slavin is here and Mr. Servalik is asking him questions about, well, did you commit a 333 Part 1 violation? That's an investigation, because Chief Slavin is only here to testify because the city is compelling him to do. This board issued a subpoena. And so, I'm the city, but you're also the city, and so that's part of the concern that we have.
You have not given us this caution with any other witness that I recollect.
Correct.
Is the distinction that there was a case against him and all the other people we've spoken to did not have a case against him?
No, the distinction is that the arguments of counsel and the statements of everything that we have heard is that the other witnesses were not argued to be, there was no notice that their conduct was going to be questioned. When we have a reasonable understanding that an investigation will issue, that's a concern, that's something that we're looking into, all of us, because these witnesses are compelled to be here, then if there's no allegation, if, for lack of a better word, if it's not on the radar, then there's no concern about that. The distinction with Chief Slavin is that, unlike every other witness we've seen, we have a claimant and an attorney who has made kind of a centerpiece of the case. Well, this other employee should be found to have violated Part 1, or this other this other witness has a potential integrity violation. And so my concern is that this is an issue that has been brought up by counsel. This is an argument that I assume that they intend to make in closing, for example. And we can't do fact-finding on other integrity issues or 333-point issues. That's not appropriate to do in a setting where Chief Slavin is compelled to be here and compelled to give testimony. And again, he's compelled to give testimony about Commander Miner, about his involvement with that, and we have no objections to any of that. But I'm trying to draw the distinction of, even if we're talking about comparative discipline, the employee who receives the discipline is not the person with the city that is controlling, disciplinary policies and whether they are evenly applied.
Hey, Counsel, I think I've heard enough. First of all, you asked the question, or you made a statement that, if he's asked, did he violate Part 1, that's a legal conclusion, and it's sort of not something I think that the board would even consider. But you can talk about facts, and that's what should be sought, not what his opinion is, because the board's going to decide. Secondly, I made note of this, you referred to the board being part of the city 3 different times. Paraphrasing the roles and responsibility of the toolbook advisory to the city council, board members are not elected officials and as such are purely advisory bodies. A sentence later, you are asked to recommend action based on your own expertise and what you hear from other, not applicable, it says other community members, and based on the information analysis of specific issues. So we're going to base on analysis of specific issues. This is the important line. The council has nominated you to this position because they trust that you exercise sound, keyword here, independent judgment and do your best to form advice for them. So I want to emphasize the board is acting independently of the city. We are not part of the city, as that term may be interpreted in a manner that would not reflect that, in fact, we are providing independent judgment. I want to make sure that's clear. The other issue is, I heard earlier that we actually have a hearing within a hearing here. We have the hearing we have to decide, and then the hearing that, and then information that may be subject to an appeal as this matter goes forward. And so I'm reluctant, I would tell Ms. Day, based upon her statements, that I'm concerned with limiting an examination because that I think would affect the due process rights of Commander Minor in this second hearing that he has to undertake. And I would probably generally agree with you that we're limited in scope to what we can do. So what I think I will do is, if during the examination of Assistant Chief Slavin, there are times when there is objection because there's an indication that it's going outside both what this body ought to hear and what would be appropriate for an appeal, we'll take argument on that and either make a decision or perhaps go into executive session if we deem it necessary. Or my counsel throws a water paper at me and I know I should go into executive session. But I think that may be better. And having said that, Ms. Day, considering any objections you may make in regards to questioning by Mr. Savalik, I'm going to say to Mr. Savalik, this witness, I'm not sure you should be asking this witness about what he thinks about anything. I think you should be asking this witness about what he did, what others did, and sort of limited to that, unless you really believe a particular question is necessary that goes beyond that. If I can't, and I'm not sure you can tell me that you want something broader without knowing what the question is. You remove the mask so you can speak better, but I think unless I have a question before me to rule on, I don't want to be making a general statement at this time. But just, to the extent you can narrow it down, because if you ask a question that's objected to, you're going to have to convince the board that it has to do, probably not so much with this hearing, but this other hearing you're going to have to handle.
Chair,
Possible.
I just want to make sure before we get to all of those other issues, I just want to correct the record that the board is part of the city. The statement does say you're to use your independent judgment, but it is not a separate jural entity, the board is not, but it is part of the city, just so that it's clear. It is a sanctioned, appointed board of the city.
And just to be clear on that, I didn't want the impression left in the record that we're part of the city, so we have to act in lockstep to the city. Because again, in the English language is ambiguous. And, that people could take it that the board's decision was preordained because they are part of the city. I want to make sure it's clear that we're going to exercise our independent judgment and not decide, in considering the burdens that we will determine, make our decision based upon that. That was the only reason for that. I know you're part of the city.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make sure that anybody else listening would understand.
It's
So
just
thank
like,
you for
courts
clarification.
are part of the state, but they're not biased in favor of the state. That's the concept.
The only
Yes,
thing that I'll say is I understand what you said. I would just ask for this, so the record is perfectly clear, this to be construed, and if Ms. Day objects, she can. But I think the record should be construed as she made a oral motion in limine, and it was denied without prejudice, subject to her renewal if an objection comes down during the hearing.
Well, I'm not even sure she would have had to make a motion in limine at the appropriate time prior to the hearing beginning. Well, let me just leave it at that. So, Ms. Day, are we ready for Assistant Chief Slavin to appear? Or do you
Just-
have-
Just one more thing, just for the record, so that it's clear. The board chair referred to a potential hearing within the hearing with respect to Assistant Chief Slavin. And this city, pursuant to the Personnel Board rules and practices, objects to the relevance of that information to any issues regarding comparative discipline with respect to Commander Minor. So I will note that.
I apologize, and again, it's the clarity of the English language. Perhaps I'm not as clear as I intended. The hearing within the hearing, maybe it's the hearing outside the hearing. I was talking about, we have our hearing, and then Commander Minor has a subsequent hearing, and I've heard over the last couple of days that what goes on here may form the record of the later hearing. And that's the one I was referring to. We're not doing any hearing on Assistant Chief Slavin.
And Chair, just to jump in there, I'm sorry, this is also Janice Blakey advising the board. I think that maybe another way to describe it would be an appeal from this hearing. There could be an appeal from a decision made as a result of this hearing, and that's what you're referring to.
That's
That
exactly
could occur
what-
in Superior Court.
Thank you. We'll leave it at that. That's, I apologize for this misunderstanding that I caused them to do that.
Okay, I will go get Chief Slavin, but I do just want to let everyone know, I am bringing this to the board's attention now instead of during the middle of questioning. My intention is not to interrupt or disrupt anyone's flow or anything like that. So my hope was that having this brief discussion would facilitate things this afternoon.
Oh, no, it's always been up to it this way.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Sure. Please stand by the witness chair. Stand, Johnson. Please raise your right hand. Do you swear affirm testimony about to be given this matter the truth and all truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state your name.
Richard Slavin.
Please be seated. Ms. Liddy, you may proceed.
Oh, he's
Oh,
Mr. Shavali's
it's being
witness.
called by Mr. Slavin, you may proceed. Excuse me?
Mass file.
One thing before you begin, just to be fair, there was some discussion before you appeared. There may be objections raised, so before you start to answer a question, or even while you're answering a question, if you get that and start answering too quickly, if you hear Ms. Day say an objection or something like that, please cease speaking immediately.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr.
Mr.
Chief, just a
I think
point
that's
of-
just fair. Yes, sir?
Point of understanding, that mic in front of you is not for amplification purposes in this
Okay.
room. It's only for the transcript recording. So if you would do your best to speak more loudly than normal, it would be helpful.
Yes, sir.
I just realized, Mr. Chair, we have a technical administrative thing. This is a city rest.
Oh,
The city rests.
okay, because I knew we had, I probably assumed too much that the next two weeks point.
At the city rest, you were just spared an hour and a half.
I'm sorry. I also wear hearing aids. Do you mind if I turn them off? just a
Certainly,
little bit?
please. And the rule so far in cell phones is not that you can't have them out, it's just that we ask that they be on silence.
This is how I.
Yeah, I, same situation sometimes. Thank you. Mr. Slavin.
Good afternoon, Chief Slavin. If you could please introduce yourself to the board and give the board a brief recap of your law enforcement history.
Rich Slavin, been with the City of Scottsdale Police Department for over 20 years. Spent a large portion of my career in investigations and special investigations. Promoted to sergeant in 2006, and promoted to lieutenant in 2012, commander in 2015, and then assistant chief in 2018.
In your role as, once you became a supervisor, have you been asked to provide input on discipline decisions that come out of the City of Scottsdale Police Department?
So the disciplinary process calls for recommendations, but not a decision.
So what's your role? So you review an investigation if it's on somebody in your chain of command, and based off of your knowledge of Scottsdale's policies and procedures, you then say, hey, I think that this should be a 8-hour suspension or verbal counseling or things like that. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, the form is actually broken down that way for each level of the chain of command to add their recommendation.
And how long have you been a supervisor?
Well, formally here since 2006.
Okay. So for almost 15 years, you've actually been evaluating internal affairs cases and making recommendations on discipline decisions?
As long as they were in my chain of command.
Right, okay, that's fair. I want to also explain to you some things that are a little different about this hearing that you might not have been familiar with, and it's actually new for council too, is the two members of the personnel board are extremely familiar with the documents and materials that are involved in this case, and they've encouraged both me and council for the city to try to move things along really quickly, but we want to make sure that the situation is completely fair to you. So the rules of the game for what both of us will be doing is that if I represent to you something in the record, it's going to be honest, or these guys and everyone else is going to lose their mind on me, which is good. But at the same time, we want to be fair to you. So if there's something where you're like, okay, that still doesn't sound right, or you want me to lay more foundation or give you more context, I'd be happy to do that, okay?
Yes, sir.
This is also far less formal than a formal court proceeding. As may happen, the members of the board might actually jump in and ask questions in between. The only thing that we do that is consistent with the court is that this is being recorded. Eventually it'll be transcribed, so it's just very important, and you're doing a good job so far, that we don't talk over each other. I'll try to let you finish and you have to try to let me finish, but if we're both talking at the same time, we have to stop so the record becomes clear, okay?
Yes, sir.
In your experience in evaluating reports for the city of Scottsdale and recommending discipline, is your experience that employees are disciplined more severely for intentional misconduct versus, I guess, negligent misconduct or forgetting to do something?
I mean, misconduct is misconduct, intentional or otherwise. So it's really more about the infraction itself that equates to discipline.
Okay. Well, let me give you an example on the outside, and then maybe I'll move more on the inside. If a police officer has a factual error in a police report, if that factual error, if you believe as a supervisor that factual error was intentional, they intentionally put false information in a police report versus it was careless or negligent, would that impact your review of that circumstance?
I mean, the actual investigation would be titled differently if that were the case.
How's that?
Well, one would be, an inaccurate record keeping versus an integrity violation.
Okay. I want to talk to you also about internal affairs and investigations. The course of your time as a sworn police officer, have you ever been in charge of conducting investigations?
You mean internal or criminal investigations?
Have you ever conducted criminal investigations?
Yes.
In what roles?
Well, I've been involved in many different types of investigations as the supervisor of a special assignments unit. So we support and assist all the units in the police department, especially from the Investigative Services Bureau.
Okay. Do you have any experience related to internal affairs?
Other than as a supervisor, as an adjunct, if you will, but I've never been assigned to internal affairs.
So internal affairs has been in your chain of command?
Yes, actually, yes. When I was the ISB Assistant Chief, correct.
Okay. And just so the board understands, because believe it or not, we haven't had testimony on this, your role has flipped. So at one point in time, you were the investigative chief, and now you're the patrol chief. Is that fair?
Yes, so the two sworn assistant chiefs, one's in charge of investigative services, the other's in charge of uniform services. And about 3 or 4 months ago, we switched places.
So how long did you serve as the assistant chief, and approximately, right? I'm not trying to create anything. How long did you serve as the assistant chief over internal affairs?
It was from when I got promoted in May of 18 to roughly June of this year.
Okay. And in the city of Scottsdale's policies and procedures, when someone goes to internal affairs as a witness, they have the same standards for truthfulness and completeness and accuracy as when they're the subject of an investigation, correct?
Yes.
Those policies mirror each other in the department, and that the expectation is that anyone going into IA is supposed to paraphrase, kind of tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right?
That's correct.
Okay. For internal affairs, for when they are actually conducting an investigation, are they supposed to have substantive conversations with the person under investigation off the record?
Say that one more time. You mean before they come in to actually conduct their interview?
Yeah, so if someone's getting called into internal affairs, let's actually just go through the process because maybe that'll help. Scottsdale typically provides a notice of investigation prior to even the day of the interview for the subject, correct?
Right.
And then the subject is scheduled to come back later on most of the time, right?
Yes.
And when they come back for that second time, when they're supposed to go in and answer those questions, are all of the material facts or information about the case supposed to be discussed on the record?
Yeah, when they come in for their interview with internal affairs, they discuss the matter.
Okay. I actually just realized this. When you were under your investigation related to the comments that were made at the patrol division staff meeting, you were actually the chain of command supervisor of Sergeant Lewis and Sergeant Gallagher, right?
Yes,
But they obviously weren't reporting to you for the purposes of that investigation, correct?
that's correct.
Do you remember having any off-the-record conversations with them prior to the tape coming on?
I don't remember that.
And if there were any off-the-record conversations with them, then that would have been improper, correct?
Objection, He's asking for an opinion about things, and I assert an objection to relevance, to ask Chief Slavin if he has opinions about things versus facts that happen.
So now, when you rephrase the question, also consider whether it's really relevant. He said he didn't have the conversations. So even with that, there's evidence that he did. It's a credibility issue. What his opinion is probably not that important at this point, unless you tell me how it is.
Well, I mean, first off, this person is definitely an expert in terms of what internal affairs is supposed to be saying. He's the person that's supervising their conduct and their proceedings as the chain of command chief. So he's absolutely the proper person. In fact, let me lay some foundation first before you go.
Remember, we've had two experts already on this issue, one on either side. So I don't know if we need a third.
And I do object on that basis to any expert testimony from Chief Slavin. Also, I object to failure to timely disclose Chief Slavin as an expert for the plaintiff pursuant to the witness exhibit disclosures provided to us weeks in advance of the hearing.
Oh, I absolutely said that everyone was going to testify consistent with their training and experience as a Scottsdale.
It's not a court of law. We don't follow rules of evidence. I want to get all the information in that you want to put in. It's material and relevant. And in that particular question, I'm not sure would be helpful to the board based upon what we've heard the last 2.5 days. So just be aware of that. I'm just concerned about asking his opinion about something that's not really having to do with the facts in this case. I'd like to have this witness, if you can, consider this witness as a fact witness. What he did, what he said, what he's aware of, what other people said, not whether this would be right or that would be right.
Well,
Because then you're getting into his expertise, unless you can connect it to something this board has to consider, or any subsequent appeal has to consider, which I assume they know what proper practice is with regard to internal affairs. I'm not sure it's something that needs to be asked.
well, I'll lay some foundation then.
Okay.
So Chief, I want to talk to you about the structure of the Scottsdale Police Department and its reporting structure for internal affairs. So internal affairs is typically staffed by 2 sergeants, correct?
Yes.
And normally in the chain of command at the Scottsdale Police Department, it goes sergeant, lieutenant, commander, assistant chief, correct?
Yes.
But the 2 sergeants in internal affairs actually directly report to the assistant chief, correct?
It is. I'd like to add a little clarification.
Sure.
So the internal affairs office is part of the chief's office. So although from a supervision standpoint, it's in writing annual ratings and things for those 2 sergeants, yeah, that falls under the Investigative Services Bureau chief. But if an investigation brought up from the Operational Services Bureau or the Uniform Services Bureau, that assistant chief is supervising the 2 sergeants for that matter. And ultimately, the chief of police is supervising the office itself.
Sure, well, and I'm not alleging, nor was I going down the road of like, you supervise your own investigation, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the expectation for the department is that you know what the sergeants assigned are doing because you are the one that's actually writing their performance reviews, right?
Yeah, so to clarify that, I may not know what they're doing in an investigation if it didn't directly impact my bureau. So even though I'm writing their annual ratings, if at the time I was the Investigative Services Bureau chief, if there was an investigation occurring in the Uniform Services Bureau, then Chief Pop would be meeting and conferring with them about that investigation.
Oh, interesting. So you don't know the results of the investigations that happen as part of the Uniform Services Bureau when you're the Investigative Services Bureau chief?
What I'm saying is that all command staff knows the results of investigations. That's covered in our staff meetings. But the day-to-day, the ongoing discussion about progress and things like that will occur with the impacted bureau chief.
Okay. So you faced, at some point, a formal investigation related to your comments that happened at the staff meeting Did you have conversations with Chief Pop that you believe that Commander Minor and Lieutenant Bonnet were out to get you?
No. So that's a much larger conversation than even one conversation. And it really related to, I never said they were out to get me. A sergeant reported up that was occurring, that Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor had multiple conversations about that, and they were reporting that in our direction. And when I heard about it, I made Chief Pop aware of that as he was Air Minor's supervisor.
Now, when did that happen chronologically? So help me out in terms of, and I'll give you some big benchmarks, and then we can try to narrow it down. So we have the meeting where the comments were made, and then we have the formal IA investigation into you that happened, and then we have the IA investigation into Commander Minor. So this conversation related to Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor being out to get you, or a series of conversations, when did those conversations happen?
Well, again, when that was brought to my attention and I brought it to Chief Pop's attention, it would have been after the meeting that you discussed, after my investigation with Chief Rodbell into my actions, and then, but before the formal investigation.
Okay, so you just said something there that I definitely want to I want to clarify. It's your belief that Chief Rodbell investigated the statements that you made related to the Patrol Division staff meeting?
Yes.
What happened? How did that, can you describe that investigation?
Sure. I came to him and reported what I had said in the meeting, and that I was embarrassed and ashamed, and he counseled me at that moment.
And in your mind, that's an investigation?
Well, I was the one that had the poor behavior, and I was confessing it to my supervisor, and he was holding me accountable for it.
I understand that, but you're saying that that qualifies as an investigation in the Scottsdale Police Department?
Yeah, I'm saying that conduct is reported at all levels and handled in different ways depending on the conduct. That doesn't mean that wasn't a process that took place.
Was it your understanding at that point that there was documentation of the investigation?
Well, the counseling and, well, first of all, I sent an email to that effect, but also it was documented in my annual performance rating.
Okay. When did your annual performance rating happen?
I forgot when they're due. I can't remember. It would have been for that year,
Okay.
for 2019. Yeah.
Do you have supervisor notes with Chief Rodbell?
Are you asking if Chief Rodbell has supervisor notes about me?
Right. Better.
I have no idea.
So you've never seen supervisor notes that Chief Rodbell keeps on you?
No,
Have you ever discussed with Chief Rodbell any supervisor notes that he might keep on you?
no.
Okay. Now, so you had the conversation with Chief Rodbell and you wrote the email. At some point after that, you had a conversation with Commander Minor about the comments that you made?
Yes.
Tell the board about that conversation.
It would have been, so the meeting happened on the 9th. I met with Chief Rodbell first thing on the 10th. I sent an email immediately following that meeting apologizing for my conduct, and it would have been probably within an hour or so of that, just a meeting in the hallway.
What did Commander Minor say to you? What did you say to him?
Commander Minor said, hey, I saw your email. I said, yeah, I feel terrible. That I let my hair down and was trying to be funny, and it was a mistake. And he said, yeah, I was going to talk to you about that. I was shocked when you said it. And I said, yeah, I'm sorry, I feel terrible, and that was that. It was probably a 1-minute conversation.
Okay. Did you think that there was anything inappropriate about Commander Minor coming to you and telling you that he had concerns about what the comment or comments that you made?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Did you make one comment or multiple comments?
Well, I said two things. They were within 2 or 3 seconds of each other. So I said something yesterday, that was my email, I said something yesterday that was offensive. That's really where I was coming from.
Okay. And what were you referring to that was offensive?
My comments in the meeting. Do you want me to specifically know what they are?
Sure.
Well, I'll say it, but I'm embarrassed and I feel horrible about it because of the way certainly the way it impacted others, but we were having a meeting that involved a rather heavy subject as we were discussing criminal investigation that had been ordered by the chief on use of force. And we were moving forward from that subject and into something else that had to do with some training that we'd been to, some debriefing, and the training involved discussion about some terrorist attacks that occurred in France. And one of those attacks occurred at a newspaper. And as I was trying to relate to the group the benefit of the training, I couldn't remember the name of the newspaper. And so I kind of opened it up. Hey guys, what's the name of that newspaper? And they started joking around French things, French fried newspaper, things like that. The mood started to lift a little bit. Somebody made a noise, some comment with like the French language, like, something like that, which had me thinking about a phrase like gay Paris. And I said, do you mean gay newspaper? And then Tom Myers, my name, I'm sorry, a lieutenant in the meeting, was joking along with that, kind of continuing with that accent. And I said, oh, are you gay? He laughed. I didn't consider really at that moment, the impact of that. I was trying to be funny. I was trying to lighten the mood in a meeting. But, I feel terrible about it. And later learned the next morning that some were offended by that. And I immediately wanted to make that right with them. That's not who I am, and it's not what I approve of even. It was a joke, and not a very good one, and I wanted to make it right. But then you run into that time where do you find out who was offended so you can personally apologize, or do they feel targeted? I didn't want to get into any of that, and it's all stuff that the chief and I discussed at length when I went into his office the next day. And so I thought the best way to do it was to send an email to everyone so that no one felt singled out.
So after you went in and talked to the chief, was it your impression that the investigation was basically not going to move at least past that there wouldn't be a formal IA investigation?
That was my impression.
Okay. And then the following Tuesday, it's my understanding that you had a meeting with Chief Rodbell and Chief